Nevada's cultural heritage is known worldwide, and it's as varied as our bright neon cities and rugged wilderness landscapes. Every week, the Nevada Department of Cultural Affairs brings a piece of that heritage to your living rooms through our documentary series, Exploring Nevada. I'm producer and host Gwen Clancy. Welcome to the colorful world of cultural affairs. In this program, we'll take a closer look at the unusual history behind a diesel locomotive now relocated to the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Boulder City, just east of Las Vegas. The locomotive seems to fit right in, but its earlier use puts it in a far different category than the other rolling stock on display here. Most of us know about the atomic testing that took place out in the middle of the Nevada desert in the mid-20th century. But fewer of us know about the railroad operation that was going on out there. Today we'll tell you some of that story and take you to some places that you probably have never been. The Nevada Department of Cultural Affairs acquired this locomotive in the spring of 2006.
The name of this engine and this railroad was the Jackass and Western, and the way it was Jackass, it ran on the Jackass flats at the test site. There are different flats on the test site, like Frenchman's Flats and Yucca Flats, and this happened to run on the Jackass flats.
We'll take a closer look at the interior later in the program, but first, we'll find out more about its earlier life. For several decades, the engine sat idle in a now quiet part of the Nevada test site, about an hour's drive north of Las Vegas. Known as Area 25, it's located southwest of where nuclear bombs were set off in the latter part of the 20th century. Time has moved on, and the world has largely forgotten this place. But on this particular March day, the locomotive was once again the focus of activity when a team from the Nevada Division of Museums and History prepared to move the 80-ton engine to its new home in Boulder City.
This is a pretty exciting and an emotional moment to take a piece of American history such as this, a piece of our atomic age, and move it to Boulder City where we can interpret it to the public. It's been here at the test site for 41, almost 42 years now, and out in Boulder City we'll be able to operate this locomotive and interpret this important piece of American history. This locomotive was built by the General Electric Company in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1964 as what's known as an 80-ton center cab locomotive. It was brought out here to the Nevada test site where the Jackass and Western Railroad, which actually had a charter from the Interstate Commerce Commission to operate as a common carrier, it served out here on the test site where they moved nuclear rocket motors out to test stands from the facility here in Area 25. So it's an important piece of history, and it's a rather unique locomotive. It had an auxiliary power unit in the event for some reason that the main locomotive failed while it was hauling a piece of nuclear material out to a test site. The auxiliary power unit provided backup power and some safety redundancy.
Ken Gary, who worked here from 1962 to 1987, was the principal operator on the locomotive.
I was here when they received it, and then I trained other operators. And this is the locomotive that's going to the museum. That's me standing on the rail. I was a primary operator that day. I'm glad the public is going to have access to some of the relics that we have out here. This equipment represents the technology at the time, and I'm glad to see that it's going to a museum rather than a scrap dealer.
The museum team has acquired a lot of rolling stock from different places over the years, but this particular locomotive came as a surprise.
There's no reason for us to ever have expected that there was a railroad on the test site. It just never came up in discussion. Being in the railroad history business, we pretty much know where all the railroads were and are, and all the equipment that ran on them in the state of Nevada. So when we were told that there was a railroad on the test site, it was pretty startling. And then when we were told we could go down and look at it, that was just unparalleled. And then finding out that we could actually acquire them was just a wonderful stroke of luck for the state of Nevada and its history. It is not connected to any other railroad. It's miles from the nearest railhead. So it's an insular railroad. It represents a time frame when railroads were not booming in Nevada, when they were not growing. That was in the Cold War era. In fact, many railroads had already died out a few years earlier. So we're filling a niche in Nevada history and railroading with this locomotive. It was a fundamental tool on that railroad. It's what made it possible to move the equipment around, but like almost everything else out there, it was just part of a much bigger story.
We'll present excerpts from U.S. government documentaries made at the time, which give us an idea of the thinking behind the project.
Deep in the mountain ranges of southern Nevada, in a desolate area long inhabited only by cactus and an occasional prospector in search of treasure. Here at a place called Jackass Flats, scientists and engineers are today building and testing nuclear rocket engines which are destined to carry 20th century prospectors to the deserts of Mars, Venus, Jupiter, and other planets of our solar system. Only 3 decades since the fissioning power of the atom was first released experimentally, these men are methodically and conclusively proving that atomic power can be harnessed and turned toward the peaceful use of propelling men through the long, dark reaches of space. The success of this propulsion program is a result of merging rocket engine technology and nuclear reactor development. Demonstration of the program's feasibility is dependent upon the evolution of procedures and methods which permit safe and precise handling of this radioactive system. As the manned control car moves toward the building, the giant 360-ton door rolls open. For purposes of illustration, a test fixture has been substituted for the engine in the following scenes. Standard gauge railroad tracks lead into the building and are also used for transporting the engine components into the various adjacent cells. A turntable 35 feet in diameter is located on the floor of the main disassembly bay and is used to turn and position the test article or its components.
The new Atomic Testing Museum at the Desert Research Institute in Las Vegas has created an exhibit that shows the layout of the complex. According to literature from the U.S. Department of Energy, it was a sprawling complex composed of test cells and assembly buildings. Connecting these facilities was the only railroad ever to operate on the Nevada test site. The Jackass and Western Railroad's purpose was to transport Project Rover reactors or engines assembled in one of the buildings to one of the 3 test cells within the complex. To accomplish this, the Jackass and Western Railroad traveled 9 miles of track and had a rolling stock consisting of 4 locomotives, a 17-ton electric prime mover, a 25-ton diesel-electric switch engine, an 80-ton diesel-electric locomotive, and a gas-powered speeder track maintenance locomotive.
There were 2 very large ALCO locomotives, production locomotives, which proved to be far too big for the railroad. They would not negotiate the curves. They didn't particularly suit the needs of it. There's a small locomotive, about 1/3 of the size of the 80-tonner, called a 25-tonner, and it was far too small for what they wanted. So they settled on an 80-ton locomotive, which was a generic industrial locomotive at the time, built by General Electric. They were sold all around the world. They were fairly common. This one was outfitted specifically for this job, in that It had an auxiliary power unit so that if it broke down, you could fire up the second unit and drive back home, hopefully getting there safely. It had a fire suppression system built into the body of the locomotive in case something caught on fire, and it had a positive pressure cab so that if there was a radiation leak, you could pressurize the cab so air would flow out of any cracks or openings, not in, to keep the workers somewhat clean. It was the most widely used of all of the locomotives. It had enough horsepower to move the test vehicles around satisfactorily and enough traction on the rails to perform on the grades and in the curves. And it was an economical locomotive to use in that instance. Parts were readily available if it broke down, easily serviced. Just a general industrial locomotive that fit that purpose excellently.
Recently, at this test stand in the Nevada desert, ETS-1, the United States successfully tested the world's first nuclear rocket engine. Its journey to the stand took more than 2 hours along its own railroad, propelled by its own rolling stock. However, the journey truly began more than a decade ago. During the next few minutes, this film will retrace this path to describe the journey to ETS-1. The nuclear rocket program began in 1955, when the Atomic Energy Commission and the Air Force began reactor studies at the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory and the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory. While several types of thermal reactors were investigated, the graphite reactor showed the greatest promise for practical development. Assembly of the first prototype nuclear rocket engine, XE Prime, began in 1968, when the reactor arrived at the Nuclear Rocket Development Station at Jackass Flats, Nevada. The reactor was delivered to the Engine Maintenance, Assembly, and Disassembly Building, specifically designed and built for the NERVA engine.
The system used to transport the completed engine to the test stand consists of a diesel-powered locomotive, which serves as the main power source, and a specially constructed mobile framework called the Engine Installation Vehicle. A shielded manned control car for operating personnel has been built and will be used for removing and transporting the radioactive engine. At the test stand, the engine is positioned and all piping, controls, and instrumentation connected. During the test, the nuclear reactor is taken critical and liquid hydrogen is pumped to the engine. As the hydrogen passes through the core, heat from the reactor raises the temperature from minus 253 degrees centigrade to more than 2200 degrees. This super hot gas then expands rapidly and is exhausted through the engine nozzle, providing the propulsion system thrust. The NERVA engine being tested here can generate over 50,000 pounds of thrust for more than 60 minutes. Once the reactor has begun operation, all engine hardware becomes radioactive and remains so even after the reactor has been shut down. From this point on, transporting and handling of the engine must be performed by remote control from behind adequate shielding as it is moved from the test stand to the hot section of the EMAD building. Much of the success of the NERVA engine and its descendants will depend upon the quality of work performed within this facility. Here in the vastness of the Nevada desert, where the power plants for tomorrow's space vehicles first come to life, a significant contribution is being made to handling technology as it keeps pace with the nation's expanding nuclear rocket propulsion program.
What lies ahead is this nation's proper exploitation of a completely new, high-performance space propulsion capability.
As these and other tests involving nuclear energy were carried out on the Nevada test site, public concerns were rising over the effects of radiation. In the late 1960s, the Nixon administration began cutting funding for the nuclear rocket project, and the space program turned its attention to developing low-cost, unmanned robotic space probes. Eventually, the nuclear rocket project lost its funding and ended in 1973.
When we first arrived at the test site to look at this locomotive in its setting, we were expecting an industrial railroad complex, but the test site is so isolated and so well protected that it was sitting out all by itself in the middle of the desert. There's no litter, there are no tracks in the desert, there are no car bodies lying around, no appliances, no trailers. The desert is absolutely pristine surrounding the small industrial complex. We were expecting to find a locomotive, much like you'd find an old locomotive today, out behind some building somewhere, not running, in bad condition, perhaps stripped of parts or vandalized. This locomotive is practically brand new. This is finding a 1940s brand new locomotive in a shed somewhere with the original paperwork in it. It was absolutely fantastic to find this.
Acquiring and moving an 80-ton piece of equipment, with or without history, is easier said than done. A special ramp had to be carried in and constructed.
Basically just building a railroad track that's a little more elevated than you're used to. It's supported with all the cribbing, and so long as everything stays together, everything works perfectly fine. Most of the weight is down. It's not going up the ramp being pulled. It's being pulled, but it's not, the weight is actually down. Well, things can go wrong. I mean, rails can break, cribbing can give way, cables can snap. Stuff does happen.
This is the heaviest locomotive that we've moved. We were fortunate that we were working on a concrete surface, which is level, and there are no problems with unevenness. We had new material to work with.
Side of the locomotive here and on the rear truck, probably.
So having built the ramp and made sure that everyone was satisfied with the ramp and the trucker was satisfied with the alignment of the trailer, we proceeded to pull the locomotive up the ramp. And as the weight gets onto this, it's going to settle and it's going to move a little bit. We watch it very carefully. We pay particular attention to it, and it can get a little tense at times if we think something might go wrong. We are used to the ramp settling out and making noise, and we have a good idea as to whether they're working satisfactorily or not. We were fairly comfortable with this. We knew it was heavy. We knew it was going to creak and groan going up. We have to be very careful in the settling of the ramp material, the cribbing underneath the rails, the support of the joints, and the transition onto the trailer. As you pull the locomotive up the ramp, it goes from a firm ramp with a blocking underneath it onto a trailer which is spring-loaded. And so there's always a transition from the firm ramp onto the trailer and the settlement of the springs that you need to be particularly careful of and make sure that nothing is going wrong. When we got the locomotive up onto the trailer and settled where we think we wanted it, we proceeded to chain the locomotive off so that it would not move when we started to take the ramp down. And so the move went very smoothly, but we were very careful that we didn't make any mistakes, because had we made a mistake, we would have lost the locomotive. We would have picked everything up and left and not gotten it.
So far, so good. But then there was the matter of the material underfoot.
The problem was it was round, sort of like marbles, and didn't compact down, so that when the trailer was rolling over it, it would sink in. It took us a long time to get out of there, and we didn't get out on the route that we had anticipated because the truck and the trailer wouldn't go through the rock. Mark did an excellent job of getting that tractor and trailer combination out of the round rock as far away from the building as he could, and could get no further because of the round rock, and in an act of desperation, if you will, made a sharp right-hand turn and drove back down and around the building, off of the rock onto the native material, the dirt there. It was noteworthy that as he was driving out of the rock and the whole truck and trailer combination was gently leaning over, he hollered out the window at one of our staff members, "Get out of the way in case it goes over." I think he was joking, but I wouldn't have stood there personally. Once the truck and trailer was out of the gravel and up on the pavement, it was a quick and easy journey off the test site to the highway and then down the highway. The trucker was very pleased with the way the locomotive moved. Low center of gravity, good load, good distribution of weight. The driver arrived at Las Vegas, picked up an escort of local police. They were leading him through the city by the designated route, missing the telephone wires and the streetlights, and he arrived in Boulder City on time and in good form. Having removed the 80-ton locomotive from the test site successfully, demonstrated that we have the capacity to do this work and that we can do it in a reasonable manner, now is a time to perhaps pursue the acquisition of the other 4 locomotives out there. One of them is absolutely specific to the history of the test site. It was built out there. It's one of a kind. It's unique in its presentation. The other 3 are production locomotives, but like the 80-tonner, they're brand new, very few miles on them, excellent condition, and would be a wonderful addition to the Boulder City Museum.
Back at the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Boulder City, volunteer Bob Friedman got right to work on the new arrival.
When we got this engine from the test site, it didn't run. It was stored for about 18 years. What we did is we had to change all the filters, we tuned her up, and we got her running. Put some new fuel in and she started right up. Both engines.
Must say something about its engineering.
Well, it hadn't been run that much. The test site didn't use it that much, so it was still in pretty good shape. Being this engine pulled nuclear rockets and there were radiation on the test sites, we're not really worried about the radiation because it was fully tested and there was no contamination found on this engine.
That's good news.
That's good news. Okay, let me show you some of the controls that they implemented in the 1950s. Basically, all these controls are the same as modern day, except they were a little different than on the regular engines. This is an 80-ton engine made by General Electric in the early 50s. It was purchased by the Navy, and the test site got it. Okay, let me show you some of the controls now on this General Electric engine. There are 2 engines. There's a forward and a back engine. There's a master switch. There are, as little knob here is a forward reverse switch. It takes you go back, make it go backwards and forwards. There are 2 master switches that control starting of the engine, number 1 and 2. The bell is right here. This is the throttle. This little knob is the throttle, and this is what gives you your forward motion. All right, this is the horn, and this lets people know that we're coming. There are 2 brakes. This is a brake that just stops the engine. This is the brake that stops the cars. It's connected to all the cars that follow, and this will put the brakes on each one of the cars. We don't have to go far.
Bob, you've driven the steam and you've driven a lot of different locomotives. How does this one feel?
This one is a lot more challenging to drive than our normal diesel locomotives. They made a lot of modifications at a test site to pull what they had to pull, and we just have not gotten that all straightened out yet. But it's a little more challenging, but it's fun. It's like always. People really still love to travel on trains. They travel on Amtrak although it's a very slow method, but you get to see a lot more than flying at 600 miles an hour and looking at the ground. So, and a lot of people who rode the old trains still love trains. We get old people from everybody was near a railroad track or a station and have stories about it.
To learn more about the atomic age in Nevada's history, you can visit the Atomic Testing Museum or the Nevada State Museum and Historical Society, both in Las Vegas. The state of Nevada operates 7 museums for the public: the Nevada Historical Society in Reno, the State Museum and the Railroad Museum, both in Carson City, the East Ely Depot Museum, Lost City Museum at Lake Mead, the State Museum and Historical Society in Las Vegas, and the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Boulder City. The museums are part of the Nevada Department of Cultural Affairs, along with the State Library and Archives, State Historic Preservation Office, and Nevada Arts Council. For more information, please visit nevadaculture.org or contact the Nevada Department of Cultural Affairs at 775-687-8323. And see you next time on Exploring Nevada.